Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something really important, homelessness in America. In 2024, we've got a ton of sources here, official reports from HUD, analyses from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, even some direct quotes from, those local groups that coordinate services, the continuums of care. But our mission today is to go beyond just the numbers. We really want to understand why this is happening, what's working to combat it, and ultimately leave you with at least one solid idea of something you can actually do about it.
Sounds like a good plan.
Okay, so let's start with that big alarming number from the HUD report. On a single night in 2024, there were 771,480 people experiencing homelessness in the U.S., and that is the highest number ever recorded.
Yes, and if you break that down, it's about 23 out of every 10,000 people in the country. Maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you compare it to 2023, it's an 18.1% jump. Both sheltered and unsheltered homelessness went up. But those living in shelters saw a bigger increase, 25.4% compared to 6.9% for those unsheltered.
And
it's not just a matter of not enough shelters, right? Because one of the COSIs, remember, those are the continuums of care. They actually said that they ran out of beds even after they expanded. So it kind of makes you wonder, what's going on here? What's pushing these numbers so high?
well, the sources kind of paint a clear picture of the forces at play here. And it's not just one thing. It's kind of this perfect storm of problems piling up.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about this perfect storm. What's going on?
Well, the biggest factor, the one we can't ignore, is the affordable housing crisis. There just aren't enough homes that people can afford, which means even if someone is working, they could still end up on the street.
Right, because it's not like wages have magically gone up to match those rising housing costs.
Exactly. The sources talk about stagnant wages for middle and lower income families.
Yeah.
While at the same time, everything else is getting more expensive. So that combination puts people in a really vulnerable position.
And I noticed the reports also brought up something that's sadly not surprising. Systemic racism. How does that play into all of this? Yeah, it's a complex issue. But the data is clear. People of color are disproportionately affected by homelessness. Think about inequalities in things like access to decent housing, job opportunities, even health care. And then there's the legacy of the criminal justice system, which makes it even harder for some people to get back on their feet.
So you're seeing a pattern here.
Right.
The system's strained from both ends. Not enough affordable housing and not enough income to access what is available. Plus, certain groups face even bigger obstacles due to these systemic issues. No wonder the numbers are so high. It's a lot to take in, honestly. But is there anything in these reports that gives us some hope?
There is. Amidst all this bad news, there's one bright spot: veteran homelessness. Between 2023 and 2024, it actually decreased by 7.6%. And here's the really impressive part. Since 2010, it's down by over 55%.
Wow, 55%. That makes you wonder, if it worked for veterans, why not for others? Is that what these sources are suggesting?
Yeah, that's exactly the argument. Anne Oliva, the CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, she says that this success is a roadmap. She believes that with the right kind of investment and policy solutions, we can replicate this and reduce homelessness across the board.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling a little more hopeful now. So what are some of these smart solutions that seem to be working? What are communities doing that's actually making a difference?
Oh, well, one of the most obvious solutions, even though it's not enough on its own, is expanding shelter capacity and services. The sources are clear that funding for all this is still inadequate, but even those stretched thin, Kalus, they're finding creative ways to help people.
So more shelters are needed. But it's not just about warehousing people, right? It's got to be about providing real support.
Exactly. The report talks about innovative funding models. Some communities are using state and local funds to fill the gaps left by federal programs. And there are some really interesting ideas out there, like using Medicaid funds to actually cover housing services, kind of like a two birds with one stone approach.
That's smart. Thinking outside the box with how we use existing resources. What else is working?
Collaboration is huge. The sources highlight successful partnerships between all sorts of groups: landlords, local courts, even public housing authorities. When everyone works together, they can tackle the problem from all these different angles and create more lasting solutions.
Makes sense. It
Yeah.
takes a village, as they say. Anything else?
There's this really interesting strategy called diversion. It's all about preventing homelessness before it even happens.
Now, that's what I'm talking about. Get ahead of the problem before it even starts. How does that work in practice?
One committee is using what they call a by-name list. They literally keep track of individuals who are at high risk of losing their housing and connect them with the right resources, whether that's financial assistance, job training, or mental health services. It's about intervening early to keep people from falling through the cracks.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the grim reality of rising homelessness
Mm-mm.
and some glimmers of hope in these strategies. But there's another piece of this puzzle we haven't touched on yet, unsheltered homelessness. And that seems to be a growing concern.
It is, and it's often in the news, but for all the wrong reasons. There's a lot of talk about making homelessness less visible, about clearing out encampments and pushing people out of sight.
But that doesn't solve anything, does it? It just moves the problem somewhere else.
You're right. The National Alliance to End Homelessness is very clear on this. Those kinds of approaches are short-sighted and ultimately harmful. They don't address the root causes and often make things worse for the people experiencing homelessness.
So what's the answer then? How do we deal with unsheltered homelessness
Yeah.
in a way that's actually effective and humane?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. But one thing is for sure, it all comes back to the lack of affordable housing and those inadequate safety nets we talked about. When people can't get into shelters or afford a place to live, they end up on the streets.
And that's a reality for a lot of people, including families. I was reading that in rural areas. 6% of families with children are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That's heartbreaking.
It is, and it highlights the fact that this isn't just a big city problem, it's happening everywhere.
So while we work on those long-term solutions, like building more affordable housing, what can communities do in the meantime? Are there any interim strategies that can help people who are currently living on the streets?
There are, but it's important to be clear about something. These are temporary measures, not solutions. The National Alliance to End Homelessness talks about these strategies in their report, but they don't endorse any specific one.
Why is that?
They're really careful about avoiding what they call quick fixes, because some approaches that sound good at first can actually do more harm than good. For example, just moving people from one encampment to another doesn't address the underlying need for housing.
Right. I see what you mean. It's about making sure we're not just shuffling people around without actually helping them. So what are some examples of these interim strategies? Keeping in mind that we're not endorsing any particular one, of course.
Sure. Well, some communities are creating temporary structures and spaces, things like safe parking programs for people living in their vehicles, tiny home villages, and even sanctioned encampments.
But those are just meant to be a safer, temporary place to stay while they wait for something more permanent, right?
Exactly. And it's crucial that participation in these programs is voluntary. Coercing people into these spaces is unacceptable. It should always be their choice.
Okay, that's a good point. So regardless of the specific strategy, whether it's short-term or long-term, what are the overarching principles that should guide communities? What will help ensure that their response to homelessness is humane and effective?
Well, the report lays out some key principles that are worth highlighting.
Okay, let's hear them. What are the non-negotiables when it comes to addressing homelessness?
Okay, first and foremost, any interim strategy, like those temporary shelters we just talked about, needs to be treated as just that, temporary. The ultimate goal should always be permanent housing. These temporary options should just exist to provide a safer place for people to stay, while more lasting solutions are developed.
Makes sense. What else?
Before diving into new programs or building new structures, communities need to take stock of what they already have. Are existing resources being maximized? Are there ways to improve existing shelters to make them more accessible and supportive? Those are the questions they need to be asking themselves.
So don't just jump into building a new shelter if you haven't even figured out how to make the ones you have work better. Good advice.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, collaboration is essential. When developing any strategy, communities need to consult with a wide range of partners, including, and this is crucial, people with lived experience of homelessness. They need to be involved in the planning process from the very beginning.
Their input is invaluable, right? They're the ones who truly understand what it's like to navigate the system.
Exactly. They can provide insights that others might miss and help ensure that the solutions being developed are actually meeting people's needs.
Okay. This is all incredibly insightful. So it seems like a big part of creating a more humane and effective response to homelessness involves making shelters themselves more accessible. What are the specific barriers that communities should be working to remove?
Yeah, there are so many barriers, some practical and some stemming from outdated rules and policies.
All right. Give me the rundown. What needs to be on the to-do list?
Well, think about the practical things first. Inconvenient locations and limited hours of operation can be huge obstacles if someone needs shelter and it's miles away with no reliable transportation, or it closes at a certain time, forcing them back out onto the streets. That's a major problem.
That's terrible. It's like setting people up to fail.
And then there are the shelters themselves. Restrictive rules can be incredibly discouraging, things like requiring identification, having strict curfews, or even banning pets. These things can deter people from seeking help, especially for someone fleeing a dangerous situation, having to produce an ID, or leave their beloved pet behind. You know, could be
It's
impossible.
almost like some shelters are designed to keep people out rather than help them.
And sadly, that's often the perception. Other common barriers include unclean or unsafe conditions, lack of personal space, and inadequate storage for belongings. If you don't feel safe or respected in a shelter, you're much less likely to stay.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for more accessible shelters and those temporary options like safe parking programs. But what about the design of those spaces? How can communities make sure that they're actually meeting people's needs
Yeah.
and creating an environment that's humane and supportive?
The report provides a framework based on universal design principles.
All right, break it down for me. What are the key elements of this humane design approach?
First and foremost, these spaces need to be accessible to everyone, regardless of ability, gender, language, or any other factor. Think ramps, assistive devices, multilingual staff. It's about making sure that everyone feels welcome and can actually use the space.
Inclusivity from the get-go. What about safety? That seems like a huge concern, especially for people who are already feeling vulnerable.
Absolutely. Security and safety are paramount. People experiencing homelessness are particularly vulnerable to harm and exploitation. So these spaces need to offer a reasonable expectation of safety, including measures to protect residents from environmental threats, violence, and abuse.
It's about creating a sense of security that might be lacking in their lives right now. What about personal space? We mentioned that as a problem in a lot of traditional shelters.
Yes, ensuring personal space is key. These spaces should offer enough room to prevent overcrowding and protect privacy. The goal is to create an environment where people feel respected and have some sense of dignity, not to just warehouse them. And that also means providing adequate and secure storage for personal belongings. People need to feel confident that their possessions are safe.
I hadn't really thought about that. But it makes sense. If you're already feeling vulnerable, having a place to keep your things safe and organized could make a big difference. What about pets? We talked about how some shelters have these restrictive policies about animals.
Right, and that's a huge barrier for a lot of people. So these interim options, whenever possible, should allow people to bring their pets. Pets provide companionship and emotional support, especially for those experiencing homelessness. Forcing someone to choose between shelter and their pet just adds another layer of trauma.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that pets are often a lifeline for people who are struggling. And finally, what about different types of families or living situations?
Accommodating diverse households is essential. These spaces need to be welcoming and accessible to families, couples, LGBTQ individuals, and anyone else, regardless of their family structure or gender identity.
It's about creating spaces where everyone feels safe, respected, and supported, regardless of who they are or who they love. And that seems like a crucial foundation for helping them move towards permanent housing.
Exactly. Now, beyond these foundational design principles, there are a lot of other things to consider when it comes to creating these spaces, things related to health, wellness, and the overall effectiveness of the program.
Okay, we're deep into the deep dive now. Let's talk about those details. What are some of the key things communities should be focusing on?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, sanitation and hygiene are essential. Access to clean restrooms, showers, and laundry facilities is crucial for maintaining health and well-being. And it goes without saying that a reliable supply of clean water and food is absolutely necessary.
Those are such basic needs, but so often overlooked. What else falls into this category?
Think about practical things, like having a place to store medications properly, especially for people who require refrigeration. And sadly, with the ongoing opioid crisis, overdose prevention measures need to be in place. Things like having naloxone readily available and training staff on how to use it.
Yeah, that's a sobering reminder of the complex challenges that many people experiencing homelessness are facing. We need to be meeting people where they are and providing the support they need to stay healthy and safe.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about basic comfort and livability. Creating a comfortable temperature, ensuring good air quality, and providing access to electricity are all important. It's about making these spaces truly livable, not just places to exist.
Right, it's about creating an environment where people can feel human dignity, not just surviving, but having some sense of well-being.
Exactly. And just as we discussed with the design principles, culturally appropriate programming and policies are crucial. These spaces need to be sensitive to the diverse needs of the people they serve. That might mean providing meals that align with certain dietary practices, offering language support, or even having gender-neutral bathrooms. It's all about making sure everyone feels respected and included.
It's about creating a sense of belonging, not just a temporary space to sleep.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, we also need to think about how these programs are designed and how accessible they are.
Okay, what are the key principles there?
The most important thing is that access to these interim options should be immediate and low barrier. That means removing as many obstacles as possible, like requiring identification or proof of need. The goal is to get people into a safe space as quickly as possible, not to create a bureaucratic maze. That discourages them from seeking help.
That makes sense. If someone's in crisis, the last thing they need is a bunch of red tape. What about ongoing support?
Even though these are temporary options, the focus should be on housing-focused strategies from day one. Ideally, people should be connected with resources and support to find permanent housing. As soon as they enter these interim spaces, it's not just about providing a bed for the night, it's about helping them move towards a stable solution.
Right. It's about giving them a hand up, not just a handout.
And to do that effectively, adequate staffing and case management are crucial. People need access to support services, like help with finding employment or securing benefits, and they need someone advocating for their needs and helping them navigate the system. That personalized support can make all the difference.
So it's not just about the physical space, it's about the human connection and support that's offered within that space. Anything else we should be thinking about in terms of program design?
Substance use is a complex issue that requires a compassionate and nuanced approach. So these interim programs need to be equipped to address substance use in a way that's both harm-reducing and supportive of recovery. It's about meeting people where they are and providing them with the resources they need to make positive changes.
And not judging them for their struggles, it's about recognizing that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing.
Exactly. And finally, data collection and analysis are crucial for measuring performance and identifying areas for improvement by tracking outcomes like how many people move into permanent housing, how long they stay in these interim spaces, and how many return to homelessness. Communities can figure out what's working and what's not. It's about constantly evaluating and improving to make sure these programs are actually helping people.
This has been a deep dive indeed. We've gone from those alarming statistics to some hopeful strategies, from the nitty-gritty details of shelter design to the overarching principles of a humane response. I feel like I have a much better understanding of the complexities of homelessness now.
Me too. And it's clear that while the challenges are significant, there are also inspiring examples of communities and organizations working tirelessly to make a difference.
And I think that's where our conversation needs to go next, to exploring those success stories and highlighting the innovative approaches that are proving effective. Because ultimately,
that's where the real change happens.
Right, in communities, on the streets, one person, one family at a time.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of those success stories, I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to homelessness. Different groups face different challenges, so our responses need to be just as diverse.
So what you're saying is we can't just lump everyone experiencing homelessness together and expect the same approach to work for everyone.
Exactly. The report talks about the importance of tailoring solutions to specific subpopulations. For example, older adults experiencing homelessness often have unique health concerns, so they might need accessible housing with support services designed for their needs. Similarly, LGBTQ youth face their own set of challenges and might benefit from housing options that are specifically designed to be safe and affirming of their identities.
That makes a lot of sense. Who else are we talking about when we talk about these different subpopulations?
Veterans, as we've already discussed, have benefited from targeted programs, but they still need continued support. And then you have people with disabilities, those struggling with mental health or substance use disorders, and families with young children. Each of these groups requires specialized resources and support to successfully transition out of homelessness.
So it's really about recognizing that everyone has a unique story and a unique set of needs. We can't just throw a blanket solution over everyone and expect it to work.
Exactly. And another factor that comes up in the report is the geographical accessibility of these housing options, both interim and permanent.
So thinking about location, location, location.
Exactly. It's not enough to just have these spaces. They need to be strategically located in areas where people can access transportation, jobs, healthcare, and other essential services. It doesn't make sense to put a shelter miles outside town with no reliable bus route.
Yeah, I guess that seems obvious when you say it out loud, but I can see how it might get overlooked.
Unfortunately, it happens more often than you might think. And in rural communities where resources are already stretched thin, the issue of accessibility becomes even more critical.
So when communities are planning these housing solutions, they need to be thinking not just about the building itself, but about the surrounding community and
Mhm.
how people will get around. It's about making it as easy as possible for people to access the support they need and get back on their feet.
Absolutely. And there's another interesting point the report makes about the surrounding environment.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about environmental hazards. You wouldn't want to place a shelter near a polluted industrial site or in an area that's prone to flooding.
Definitely not. It seems like common sense. Yeah. But I can see how it might not always be a top priority.
It's about prioritizing the health and safety of the people who will be living there, not just finding any available space. And it also ties into the idea of integrating these housing options into the community rather than isolating them.
So it's not just about the physical location,
Mm.
but about how these spaces fit into the fabric of the neighborhood,
Uh.
creating a sense of belonging and
Good.
fostering a supportive environment.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, one of the most important concepts that comes up in the report is the idea of housing first approaches.
Okay. Remind me what that means exactly.
It's a philosophy that prioritizes providing permanent housing as quickly as possible, without preconditions, like sobriety or employment. The idea is that once someone has a stable place to live, they're better equipped to address other challenges in their lives.
So it's about getting people into housing first, and then providing the support they need to stay housed and work on other goals, rather than making those things prerequisites for housing.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research that shows just how effective this approach can be in reducing chronic homelessness.
That's really encouraging. Are there any specific examples of how this is being implemented in the real world?
Many communities are using rapid rehousing programs, which provide short-term financial assistance and support services to help people move quickly out of homelessness and into permanent housing.
So it's kind of like providing a bridge to stability, helping people overcome that initial financial hurdle and get their foot in the door.
Exactly. And the report also mentions permanent supportive housing, which is a longer-term option. That combines affordable housing with ongoing support services for people with disabilities or chronic health conditions.
It sounds like there are a lot of different models emerging, but they all share that common thread of prioritizing housing as the foundation for everything else.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really positive development. For a long time, the focus was on managing homelessness, on providing temporary shelters and crisis services. But now we're seeing a shift towards recognizing that the real solution lies in providing people with the security and dignity of a permanent home.
It's about treating housing as a human right, not a privilege.
Exactly. And that's a powerful idea that I think is starting to gain traction.
This is all so fascinating. We've covered so much ground already, from those initial alarming statistics to some really promising strategies and approaches. It feels like we're moving from a place of despair to a place of possibility.
I agree. And while the challenges are still huge, it's clear that there are people out there who are working tirelessly to make a difference.
Which brings me to my next question. What are some of the specific programs or initiatives that are really making a difference out there? I'm ready to hear about some real-world success stories.
Okay, so let's dive into some examples of how these principles and strategies are being put into action on the ground. Because ultimately, that's where the real change happens, right?
Absolutely. It's one thing to talk about these ideas in the abstract, but I want to hear about how they're actually making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, there are tons of examples. One that comes to mind is the Built for Zero initiative. It's this movement of over 100 communities across the U.S. that are committed to actually ending homelessness, starting with specific populations.
So they're not just aiming to reduce homelessness, they're actually trying to make it a thing of the past. That's ambitious.
It is, but what's really interesting is their approach. They use real-time data to track their progress, figure out where the gaps are in their system, and then quickly adjust their strategies based on what's working. It's kind of like a data-driven, constantly evolving approach to tackling homelessness.
So they're not just throwing ideas at the wall and hoping something sticks. They're being really strategic and data-informed. And is it working?
It seems to be. Several communities involved in Built for Zero have actually achieved functional zero for veteran homelessness and chronic homelessness.
Okay. What does functional zero mean? Is that like saying there's literally no one experiencing homelessness in those categories?
Not quite. It means that homelessness for those specific populations is rare and they've essentially built a system where people are connected to housing and support so quickly that long-term homelessness is basically eliminated.
So they're not just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, they're actually getting to the root of it and preventing people from falling through the cracks. That's impressive.
And another key aspect of Built for Zero is their focus on collaboration. They bring together everyone who has a stake in the issue: government agencies, nonprofits, businesses, even people with lived experience of homelessness, and get them all working together towards that common goal.
It's that it takes a village approach we talked about earlier.
Oh.
Everyone working together, pooling their resources and expertise to create real and lasting change.
Exactly. And the results speak for themselves. Communities participating in Built for Zero are seeing significant reductions in homelessness, and they're proving that ending homelessness isn't some utopian dream. It's an achievable goal.
That's so inspiring. It gives you hope that even in the face of such a complex and widespread problem, real progress is possible. Are there any other programs or initiatives that are worth highlighting?
Definitely. The report also talks about some promising developments. In the area of supportive housing, for example, some communities are experimenting with new models of permanent supportive housing that are specifically designed for families with children.
So not just providing a roof over their heads, but also wraparound services to address the needs of the whole family.
Exactly. These programs might include things like childcare, educational support, job training, and parenting classes. The goal is to give families the stability and resources they need to not just survive, but to thrive.
It's about breaking that cycle of poverty and homelessness and giving families the tools to build a better future for themselves and their kids. That's powerful.
And on the topic of innovative funding models, there's a lot of buzz around social impact bonds as a way to finance homelessness programs.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand how it works. Can you break it down for me?
Sure, essentially. Social impact bonds allow private investors to provide the upfront funding for a program, and then they get paid back based on the program's success in achieving certain outcomes. So if the program successfully reduces homelessness or helps people find jobs, the investors get a return on their investment.
So it's like investing in social good
Mhm.
with a financial incentive to make sure the program actually delivers results. That's a really interesting concept.
It is, and it's starting to gain some traction. There have been some successful pilots, particularly in the area of supportive housing.
Right.
For example, in Denver, they used a social impact bond to fund a program that provides housing and support services for people experiencing chronic homelessness.
And what were the results?
The program was very successful. It significantly reduced chronic homelessness in the city and actually saved the city money in the long run by reducing the need for more expensive emergency services.
So it's a win-win. It helps people get off the streets, and it saves taxpayers money.
Yeah.
That's the kind of innovation we need.
Absolutely. Another area where we're seeing some really cool innovations is in the use of technology to connect people with resources and support.
Oh, I'm curious about that. Tell me more.
Well, there are apps and online platforms that help people experiencing homelessness find things like available shelter beds, food pantries, healthcare services, and other essential resources.
This is like putting all the information they need right in their pocket. That's amazing.
It is, and some communities are even using predictive analytics to identify individuals who are at high risk of becoming homeless so they can intervene early and prevent it from happening in the first place.
Wow. That's using technology in a really proactive and preventative way. Instead of just reacting to homelessness after it's already happened, they're trying to stop it before it even starts.
Exactly, and I think it really highlights the potential for technology to play a game-changing role in the fight against homelessness.
It's so encouraging to see all these different approaches and innovations popping up all over the country. Feels like we're finally starting to move in the right direction.
I agree, and one of the most encouraging trends I'm seeing is the growing involvement of people with lived experience in shaping policies and programs.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
They're the experts after all. They know firsthand what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. And more communities are recognizing the value of their expertise and including them in decision-making processes.
It's about shifting power dynamics and ensuring that the people most affected by homelessness have a say in the solutions.
Absolutely. And that's a really powerful shift that I think will lead to more effective and equitable outcomes in the long run.
All right, so let's talk about those real-world success stories then. You mentioned that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but are there any approaches out there that are particularly effective or innovative?
Well, a few that really stand out. One that comes to mind is the Built for Zero initiative. It's a movement of over 100 communities across the U.S. that are committed to actually ending homelessness, starting with specific populations.
So they're not just aiming to reduce it, they're actually trying to make it a thing of the past. That's
Wow.
ambitious.
Yeah, it is. But what's really interesting is their approach. They use real-time data to track their progress, figure out where the gaps are, and then they quickly adjust their strategies based on what's working. It's like a data-driven, constantly evolving approach to tackling homelessness.
So they're not just throwing ideas at the wall and hoping something sticks. They're being really strategic
Mm.
and data informed.
Mm.
And it's working.
It seems to be. Several communities involved in Built for Zero have actually achieved functional zero for veteran homelessness and chronic homelessness.
Okay, what does functional zero mean exactly? Is that like saying there's literally no one experiencing homelessness
Yeah.
in those categories?
Not quite. It means that homelessness for those specific populations is rare and brief. They've essentially built a system where people are connected to housing and support so quickly that long-term homelessness is basically eliminated.
So they're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. They're getting to the root of it
Mm.
and preventing people from falling through the cracks.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah. And another key aspect of Built for Zero is their focus on collaboration. They bring together everyone who has a stake in the issue: government agencies, nonprofits, businesses, even people with lived experience of homelessness, and get them all working together toward that common goal.
It's that it takes a village approach we were talking about earlier. Everyone working together, pooling their resources and expertise to create real and lasting change.
Exactly. And the results speak for themselves. Communities participating in Built for Zero are seeing significant reductions in homelessness. And they're proving that ending homelessness isn't some utopian dream. It's an achievable goal.
That's so inspiring. It gives you hope that even in the face of such a complex and widespread problem, that real progress is possible. Are there any other programs or initiatives that are worth highlighting?
Definitely. The report also talks about some promising developments in the area of supportive housing. For example, some communities are experimenting with new models of permanent supportive housing that are specifically designed for families with children.
So not just providing a roof over their heads,
Mhm.
but also wraparound services to address the needs of the whole family.
Exactly. These programs might include things like childcare, educational support,
Yeah.
job training, and parenting classes. The goal is to give families the stability and the resources they need to not just survive, but to thrive.
It's about breaking that cycle of poverty and homelessness and giving families the tools to build a better future for themselves and their kids. That's powerful.
Yeah, and on the topic of innovative funding models, there's a lot of buzz around social impact bonds as a way to finance homelessness programs.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand how it works. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. Essentially, social impact bonds allow private investors to provide the upfront funding for a program, and then they get paid back based on the program's success in achieving certain outcomes. So if the program successfully reduces homelessness or helps people find jobs, the investors get a return on their investment.
So it's like investing in social good, with a financial incentive to make sure the program actually delivers results. That's a really interesting concept.
It is, and it's starting to gain some traction. There have been some successful pilots, particularly in the area of supportive housing. For example, in Denver, they used a social impact bond to fund a program that provides housing and support services for people experiencing chronic homelessness.
And what were the results?
The program was really successful. It significantly reduced chronic homelessness in the city and actually saved the city money in the long run by reducing the need for those more expensive emergency services.
So it's a win-win. It helps people get off the streets, and it saves taxpayers money. That's the kind of innovation we need.
Absolutely. Another area where we're seeing some cool innovations is in the use of technology to connect people with resources and support.
Oh, I'm curious about that. Tell me more.
Well, there are apps and online platforms that help people experiencing homelessness find things like available shelter beds, food pantries, healthcare services, and other essential resources.
So it's like putting all the information they need right in their pocket. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And some communities are even using predictive analytics to identify individuals who are at high risk of becoming homeless so they can intervene early and prevent it from happening in the first place.
Wow, that's using technology in a really proactive and preventative way.
Yeah.
Instead of just reacting to homelessness after it's already happened, they're trying to stop it before it even starts.
Exactly. And I think it really highlights the potential for technology to play a game-changing role in the fight against homelessness.
It's so encouraging to see all these different approaches and innovations popping up all over the country. It feels like we're finally starting to move in the right direction.
I agree. And one of the most encouraging trends I'm seeing is the growing involvement of people with lived experience in shaping policies and programs.
That makes a lot of sense. They're the experts, after all. They know firsthand what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. And more communities are recognizing the value of their expertise and including them in those decision-making processes.
It's about shifting power dynamics and ensuring that the people most affected by homelessness have a say in the solutions.
Absolutely. And that's a really powerful shift that I think will lead to more effective and equitable outcomes in the long run.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've gone from those alarming statistics to some truly inspiring stories of innovation and progress. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the complexities of homelessness now, and I'm feeling cautiously optimistic about the future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on homelessness in America, we want to leave you with a thought. What can you do right now to make a difference in your community? Maybe it's volunteering at a local organization, donating to a Housing First initiative, or simply educating yourself and others about the issue. We can all play a part in creating a world where everyone has a place to call home. Thanks for joining us.